Hello and welcome to Dogs with Torches. In this episode, we are joined with a returning guest, Father Dylan Schrader, to discuss the medieval and early modern debate on Mariology, known as Debitum Peccati. Since the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception became so popular, even eventually on a magisterial level in the late Middle Ages, theologians were tasked to explaining the way in which Mary was exempt from original sin on account of the Immaculate Conception, and what her connection was, if any, with Adam's headship. Today, we are joined Father Schrader to discuss both the Debitum in the medieval context and the position of the later Carmelite theologians, the Salmanticenses, on the question of the Debitum. Father Schrader, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much. Great to be back with you.
Yeah, I figured we could have you on. We could discuss maybe what the debate is all about, what the concern is, and eventually what the position of the later Carmelites are on this question. But before we do all that, I figured we could just dive right in and discuss, how exactly did the medieval theologians understand original sin? I mean, was it something that was contracted in the way that like an illness is contracted? I mean, how did they understand that whole issue?
Well, that's the question. And that's the background to understanding why the theological speculation as to a Debitum Peccati arose in the first place. Because to talk about the Debitum Peccati, we actually have to go a couple steps back. So the reason you would talk about a Debitum Peccati is that you're convinced of two things. And now we're speaking within the context of Mariology. Okay, so in general, all of us have a Debitum Peccati. Okay, but the question is about Mary because of the Immaculate Conception. So the reason why you would raise the question of a Debitum Peccati is if you are convinced of the Immaculate Conception of Mary, and also you're convinced that Mary is redeemed by Christ. So if you believe those two things, you have to find some way of resolving that. So to understand the Debitum Peccati, we have to understand what the Immaculate Conception is and its connection with redemption as a theological notion. But to understand that, we have to understand something about original sin. Now, even today, there are a variety of legitimate theological theories in their details about the mechanism of original sin. But just to kind of set the stage, maybe to do a very, very brief kind of caricature or sketch of how we get to this point, sacred scripture in Romans 5 speaks, especially in the Latin version and the way it was interpreted, speaks of people sinning in Adam. Now, you can debate whether that's a correct translation or not, okay? But as a matter of fact, the church has doctrinally understood that however the passage in Romans 5 is to be translated correctly, it is speaking about the fact that in some way we are implicated by Adam's personal sin, and we are implicated by reason of our connection with him, especially through physical descent, that is through biological lineage. Okay, so in Latin, it talks about Adam in quo omnes peccaverunt, that is, in whom everyone sinned. Okay, so they took that really literally. Now, especially St. Augustine. So St. Augustine, as you recall, as his career develops, is concerned about the problem of Pelagianism, which has to be addressed. So at that time, 4th century, early 5th century, the sharper distinctions that would be drawn later on between, say, the natural and the supernatural are not yet totally worked out. There is clearly a sense that there is something called nature and something called grace, but to map those directly onto the natural and the supernatural, as that will later be understood in, say, the 13th or 14th century, especially the 15th century, that isn't all worked out yet. So Augustine is one of the major figures in the development of the Western doctrine of original sin in the way that we articulate it. Now, first, I want to distinguish two senses of the term original sin. So theologians call these originating original sin and originated original sin. Originating original sin means literally Adam's personal sin. That is the original sin, the first sin committed by our first parents, especially Adam. It's a topic for another day, but a very interesting one theologically, the way in which Adam and Eve had distinct and unequal roles in the commission of the first sin. So theologians actually do speculate about that. What if Eve had sinned and Adam had not? Or in what way did they both contribute to this single sin? But that's a totally different topic. So
Right.
we'll have to do that for a different episode. But
Sure.
anyway, okay. So Adam commits a personal sin. That's the original sin. However, that has an impact on his descendants. Okay. And we call that originated original sin. So we have to be careful about which one we're talking about. Are we talking about the original personal action, or are we talking about the effects of it? Now, we call originated original sin sin. So that leaves us with a question. What exactly does that mean? In what way can a child who's being conceived be said to be conceived with a sin? And that's the question. So there's a lot of factors that go into developing an explanation for that. So for one thing, as it became clearer that the human soul is spiritual and that it is not passed down from the parents to the child, but is instead created directly by God. As that became clearer and became really the majority theological opinion, and I would say at least a Catholic doctrine, but in the history of the church, there were people who thought the soul is in some way passed down from parents to children. Okay. But that became a real minority position, and I would say today is ruled out by Catholic teaching. Okay. So if the problem is this, if the soul is created directly by God and is not inherited from the parents, and if sin is something that is in the soul, how is this possible? So you get a variety of theories. So maybe it's that sin in this sense is not something in the soul directly, but actually is in the flesh, in the DNA. And there's this flawed flesh, this infected flesh, caro infecta, that's being passed down from parent to child. And that's what happens. The theologians began to see problems with that. Augustine kind of recognizes there's some kind of issue with that idea, that sin is in the DNA and it's being passed down in that way. But he wants to retain this idea that sin can't be something in the soul when it's being created by God from God. That is, God's not creating a stain or a flaw in this new soul that he just made. So in what way is the soul infected via physical descent from Adam? Well, Augustine basically says it's through the concupiscence of the parents. So the parents, in the act of conceiving a new child, cooperate with God in the creation of that new human being. So God creates the soul directly, but the parents provide the body or the matter that will be that will receive that soul. And so in the act of conceiving the child, Augustine thinks there's going to be some concupiscence in play. And in some way that vitiates or affects the newly conceived matter that will receive the soul. And that is what original sin in us basically is. So that we are receiving a human nature that's a true human nature, but as soon as we get it through our conception, it's flawed. It's affected by the concupiscence of our parents in this way. Okay. That is problematic for a number of reasons. Now, there's versions of that theory that the church has never officially dogmatically ruled out. Okay, so within the umbrella of Catholic dogma, within the parameters set by that, there are actually a variety of ways to explain original sin. However, by the time you get to the Middle Ages, the High Middle Ages, the more favored theory, you'll see this, for example, in St. Thomas, and he actually develops his thought on this over the course of his career. So from his commentary on the sentences to the Summa, there's definitely development in this. St. Thomas begins to realize that it really can't work that way. You know, it can't be that the flesh itself is actually infected. There's also a clearer distinction between the natural and the supernatural, and between what is due to human nature, what is proportionate to human nature, and what is beyond proportion to human nature, and what is a superadded gift. So especially at the end of Aquinas' career, and then those who follow in that tradition, they're going to go in a different direction. And they're going to end up saying that although biological descent from Adam is a necessary condition for inheriting original sin, it is not a sufficient condition. So it's not merely the biological factor that causes you to get original sin when you're conceived. It's something else in addition to that. And that is going to be Adam's headship. So it's the covenant. It's the pact or the agreement or the promise that God forms with Adam. So God constitutes Adam as the moral head, that is the leader of the entire human race, and gives him certain gifts in addition to human nature in its pristine state. And those gifts as a complex comprise the state of original justice. So habitual grace together with what are eventually called the preternatural gifts. Now, the promise has a condition, namely that Adam has to remain loyal. So if Adam remains loyal to God, then when his children and their children's children and so forth are created, when they're conceived, they are also going to get the gift of original justice, which is a gift over and above human nature. So in this way, it's clear that the supernatural and preternatural elements are coming from God. They're not being passed down, because grace can't be passed down from one person to another like DNA can. But at the same time, there is the factor of biological descent, because the covenant or the pact depends on Adam's headship, which itself depends on the fact that he is the progenitor of the human race. Okay, so if that's the theory of original sin, that allows you to do several things. For one thing, it allows you to account for the distinction between nature and the supernatural. It allows you to account for the fact that the concupiscence in parents shouldn't affect the soul of the child newly created by God. And it also allows for you to say that human nature, as it's being passed down, is itself actually not flawed. It is received in a flawed way or in a flawed state, inasmuch as the newly conceived child is missing something that God wanted him to have and that he would have had had Adam not sinned, and that those extra gifts are needed to stabilize the living out of human nature. That left to itself, human nature it does tend to become unstable, and so those extra gifts are helpful for that. So this is very good, because it means that human nature is still intact. Nature is not broken in itself, but it is missing the helps that it was supposed to have. So the child, as a result of Adam's sin, is really lacking something. And there is a sense of voluntariness to it. It's not voluntariness in the child, but it's the voluntary action of Adam, who forfeited these gifts for himself and for his descendants. It would be like if the father of a family goes out and sells the car, for some magic beans or something. Now, nobody has it. Okay, so his personal choice affects the entire family. And that's the idea of moral headship. So, okay, as people become more convinced that this is a better way to talk about original sin, the question of Mary naturally comes in. Now, it's clear that Christ is not affected by original sin, even though he's descended from Adam, and that's by reason of his divine personality. So I want to just add one little tangent here. Sometimes people think that the reason for the dogma of the Immaculate Conception, or the reason for the fact of the Immaculate Conception, is to provide a kind of stopgap measure to stop original sin a step before it gets to Jesus.
Right.
Because if Mary had original sin, she would have passed it down to Jesus. That's not at all the reason for it. And actually, St. Thomas is quite clear about this, regardless of the question of what he thinks about the Immaculate Conception over the course of his career. But he says specifically that no matter what situation you have, because Jesus is a divine person, he can't possibly contract original sin. So that's not the reason for the Immaculate Conception. As people begin to think about the uniqueness of Mary, and the question of the history of the dogma of the Immaculate Conception is actually a fascinating topic and could be looked into in an entirely different podcast. But I will say this: the way a question is asked shapes the answer that's given. So when you begin to ask new questions based on new and more precise concepts, things can get complicated. And that's one reason why the dogma of the Immaculate Conception has such a complicated development, because the early church was convinced of Mary's unique holiness. They were convinced that Mary was full of grace in some mysterious and special way. But they didn't yet have the concepts in place to ask the precise questions, for the most part, that would later become questions about the Immaculate Conception, which makes sense because the Immaculate Conception as a dogma is defined in relation to the dogma of original sin. So we don't know what the Immaculate Conception is till we know what original sin is. And it took a long time to work out a good theory of what original sin is. So here's an example of how things could go off the rails. And there were theologians who held that original sin is literally passed down biologically, and who also believed in the Immaculate Conception of Mary. So the way they accounted for that was they said there's actually a part of Adam's body that is uninfected. Like his body, his flesh is being literally infected like a disease, but there's actually part of it that remains untouched by that disease, like a single cell even. And that gets passed down from generation to generation and eventually becomes the matter from which Mary's body is formed. So that she's preserved from original sin because her flesh is made from that one cell that was uninfected by that original disease of Adam's sin. Okay. So that's not the direction you want to go. That's not a good explanation, but you can see how what we think about original sin and how it's transmitted impacts deeply how we think the Immaculate Conception works. Okay, so when it comes to the Immaculate Conception, then what do we want to say? We want to say, as the dogmatic definition says, that Mary is preserved immune from all stain of original sin, and that this is by a unique privilege. It's also in view of the merits of Christ the Redeemer. So I gave a little historical overview of original sin, but from a systematic perspective, I think the starting point for talking about original sin is actually not to just say there's something really wrong with the world and everybody's affected by it in some way. That is a starting point. And you can certainly do that to say there's something wrong with humanity at large. However, I would suggest that the real starting point, the better one, is to look at Christ and to say we should be so convinced of the uniqueness and the importance of Christ as Redeemer that we are led to say that there is a universal need for redemption. In other words, we have to be able to say that even a newly conceived child, even a baby, needs redemption by Jesus, and that is the systematic starting point for the doctrine of original sin. It's to say Christ is the universal Redeemer, and therefore we have to account for a way in which all humanity, even those who have no personal sin, need redemption. So the question is, how does that apply to Mary? Because if Mary is, in fact, conceived without stain of original sin, and at the same time, that's a unique privilege, and at the same time, we want to say that she is redeemed by Christ, how do we account for that? And that's where the Debitum Peccati comes in. So that discussion arose as the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception began to become more and more common. And in a nutshell, now this is the Debitum Peccati is perhaps one of the most complex topics in speculative theology. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One is that the terminology developed all over the place, and it became, I mean, each author almost had their own terms for talking about it.
Right.
And it also involves a lot of conditionals and a lot of thinking about counterfactuals and things like that. Anyway, and it implicates other dogmas that are important and things. So it's a very confusing topic. But in a nutshell, the Debitum Peccati, what does that mean? Well, it could be translated the debt of sin. Debitum means debt. However, the word debt there itself raises a lot of questions. What does that mean? What is a debt? It's something that's owed. It's a kind of obligation. In Latin, the word debitum comes from the verb debere, which means to owe. It also means ought. You ought to do something. It also means you have to do something. So the Debitum Peccati is sort of the would have to of sin, or the
Mm.
ought of sin, the oughtness of sin. And it comes into play when you say this, that there's a sense in which Mary should have or ought to have contracted original sin.
Mm.
So that's the question. If Mary is in fact being preserved from something, and that's a privilege, and if it's redemption, then that means there's something that should have happened that was averted in some way.
Right.
That's the question of the Debitum Peccati. In what sense can we say Mary should have contracted original sin? Or can we say that?
Right. I mean, sometimes it's a little bit misleading to think about the debitum, to translate it literally as like, the debt of sin, because I mean, that's the more, as you said, the more appropriate way of translating it is the conditional, it would have and could have and should have contracted sin. That's more the concern given, Adam's headship and the temporal order of history. And I like what you said about how the shift of original sin, it changes from discussing, infected matter or infected body to discussing the question of Adam's moral headship, because I think that this is another concern that is underlying the Debitum debate: is what is Our Lady's connection, if any, to Adam's headship? Like, is she connected in some way? Does she belong to a completely different order of history? That's another concern, I think.
It is, absolutely. So this overlaps with a lot of other discussions that are going on in the late medieval and early modern period. So think about the debates over predestination, divine providence in general, the motive of the incarnation. All these things have to do with the way God has planned for the order of history and whatever conditionals might be involved in that. So the way things are versus the way they might really have been. Within semantics and logic in the late medieval and early modern period, there's also tremendous developments in the question of counterfactuals, future contingents, the truth value of propositions, all sorts of things like that. So we have to remember, it's not only the theological context, strictly speaking, but also in just logic and in what we would call semantics. There are all these treatises being written about propositions and sophisms and all sorts of ways of looking at inference, and what does it mean to say something is possible. And these are questions that go back to Aristotle, certainly, but they really get developed. So there's a lot going on. So the question of headship becomes really important, because Christ is the new head of the human race. He is the new Adam. So the question is, in what way is Mary and her being predestined to be the mother of God, in what way is she, as an individual, related to the headship of Adam and related to the headship of Christ? So there's a variety of positions you can take. Like I said, each author almost has his own terminology. So in very broad strokes, about the most general distinction you can make that was made is between a remote debt of sin and a proximate debt of sin, a debitum remotum and a debitum proximum. Now, there's a whole lot of other versions of that, but that's a very broad categorization. Okay, so debitum proximum is the easier one to understand, the proximate debt of sin. This is basically saying that Mary, being descended from Adam biologically, which is a fact, is under his headship at her conception. Therefore, she ought to have contracted original sin, but the privilege of the Immaculate Conception is that God makes an exception for her in that case, and so she actually does not contract original sin, even though she should have by reason of physical descent from Adam. And you can explain the details of that in a variety of ways. So, for example, is there infected flesh? What does it mean to have infected flesh? Things like that. Okay, we can leave those details aside. The remote debt, debitum remotum, removes Mary a step further from the contraction of original sin in the providential order. That is, by saying Mary, by reason of physical descent, should have been under Adam's headship, but actually God prevented her from falling under the moral headship of Adam and had her only ever under the moral headship of Christ, so that Mary's relationship to Adam is biological. She's a real descendant of his, but she's never actually under him in terms of the covenant that God made. There's a couple ways to explain that. So one would be that when God makes the original covenant with Adam, he exempts Mary from it, because that covenant can be whatever terms God wants. So God can say to Adam, you and all your descendants will have the gift of original justice unless you are disloyal to me, in which case all your descendants will lose it, except for the Blessed Virgin Mary, in view of the future covenant that I will make with Christ.
Right.
You could say it that way. You could say that Mary simply was always under Christ's headship by virtue of her predestination together with him as the mother, as his mother, and so therefore her only relationship to Adam is a biological one. However, the Debitum Remotum, I will say, does add this. It is not only that Mary is physically descended from Adam, it is also that there is a real sense in which she ought to have been under his headship. And this makes both of these theories different from the position of some who would in fact deny that Mary had any debt of sin. That is, that she had no obligation or no oughtness to contract sin, that there is no sense in which she should have contracted original sin. So we're, in a nutshell, left with kind of three versions in broad strokes of looking at the Debitum Peccati. Either there's a proximate debt of sin, there's a remote debt of sin, or there's no debt of sin at all.
So if I may ask, what exactly is the connection to predestination with respect to the Debitum? Because as I understand it, and you alluded to it at the very end, certain Franciscan theologians would exempt Mary from any sort of Debitum simply on account of predestination, the joint predestination of Christ and Mary, and the primacy of Christ. So, how exactly does predestination fit into the question of the Debitum?
They are connected questions, and as you point out, the Franciscans were earlier adopters of the Immaculate Conception than some of the other major religious orders and their theological traditions. So, to their credit, and Duns Scotus, of course, famously is the doctor of the Immaculate Conception, and for good reason, for very good reason. Now, eventually, of course, today it's a defined dogma of faith, but eventually, essentially every theological school came to endorse the Immaculate Conception, especially in certain areas where it had special support. So in Spain, for example, it had it had special support in certain areas, but the magisterium was very careful and left lots of room for theological discussion, but gradually came to favor the Immaculate Conception more and more and more. If we get to talking about the Carmelites, that's actually one of the things that got them in trouble with the Inquisition.
Right.
But so the Franciscans, so the Franciscans have a couple of things that are connected, and there's connection and overlap. And Trent Pomplin has shown this in a chapter of his in the Oxford Handbook of Early Modern Theology. I think it's, what is it, Baroque? It's Baroque Theologies of Christ and Mary, or Baroque Christologies and Mariologies, something like that. I apologize, I can't remember the exact name of it, but it's in the Oxford Handbook of Early Modern Theology, and it's a chapter, Baroque Catholic Theologies of Christ and Mary. I think that's it. He looks at the fact that if you were someone who held to the Immaculate Conception, you were also more likely to hold to certain theories of predestination in relation to, for example, the motive of the incarnation and things like that. And it makes sense these would all be connected. Okay, so if you hold that Christ is predestined, that is, as man, so in other words, that the effective decree of the incarnation is planned by God prior to taking into account sin, and you hold that Mary is included in numerically the same decree of predestination with Christ, then it kind of falls into place that she would be exempted from sin, because essentially God is decreeing Jesus and Mary before even thinking about sin, so to speak, in the planning process. So that makes perfect sense. In that sense, Mary is in God's plan prior to anything about sin.
Mm.
So she's exempted from it. Okay. Now, if you are someone who holds that Christ is predestined in a way that takes sin into account, along with which position it's more likely that you also hold that his predestination is effectively dependent on the permission of sin in some way. There's a whole variety of ways of explaining that. Then you can apply the same thing to Mary, because Mary is closely associated with Christ. And so whatever you think about Christ's relationship to the permission of the whole fall to begin with, you are going to extend that to Mary in some way, most likely. So there's a lot of overlap in these positions. And a lot of this gets into the question of how do we explain the logical moments or stages in God's decision-making process? Because that's where everything has been pushed back now. With the question about moral headship and the importance of the covenant or the pact that God makes with humanity, as opposed to just the mere biological fact that we have DNA that's been passed down and so forth. When you push things back, then you're going to ask questions about the planning process. So what are the conditions of this covenant? Is the covenant with Christ before the covenant with Adam in the planning process or not? It comes after in time, but in the planning process, is it before or after? And in what way does Mary factor into that? So there's a huge amount of overlap among these different theological topics.
Right. All right, then. Well, I figured if it's okay with you, maybe we could shift to talking about the Salmanticenses in particular and discuss their position on this topic. Because, I mean, interestingly enough, the Salmanticenses, I mean, we've discussed them on the podcast before about their theory on the motive of the incarnation, but they themselves, as you've said, have a developed theory on the Debitum Peccati. So what can you tell us about the Salmanticenses version of the Debitum?
So it was controversial at the time. It's probably the lengthiest and the most detailed treatment of the question at the time that it's written. So it's written in the early to mid 1600s within their course of theology. It's written by Domingo de Santa Teresa. So one of the early writers of the Cursus Theologicus. So there were 5 writers of it, basically, several major ones, 2 relatively minor ones, but it was a course of theology by the Discalced Carmelites, professors at Salamanca, who put together this huge course of theology. But it's not the work of just one person. So, but this particular tract was, I believe, written by Domingo de Santa Teresa, early to mid 1600s. And at that time, it's, to my knowledge, the most detailed and thorough treatment of the question to begin with. Now, it's superseded in later generations. So Montalbani, for example, writes even bigger treatise on the Debitum Peccati. Okay.
Right.
Now, the issue is, okay, so remember, they're in Salamanca, they're in Spain. Okay. Spanish Carmelites. The Immaculate Conception is essentially a given. You know, you're going to get into trouble if you deny the Immaculate Conception. Now, these Carmelites did not deny the Immaculate Conception. They were big proponents of the Immaculate Conception, but they were denounced to the Inquisition because their treatment of the Debitum Peccati, some people thought it was a cipher or a stalking horse for denying the Immaculate Conception of Mary. So basically, right, this is a subterfuge. We're not saying Mary had original sin, but we're arguing that she really should have had original sin.
Sure.
So they thought that this was a little too close to it. There's also some infelicities in the way that they say things. these guys were serious theologians, and they use terms very precisely a lot of the time. So they say things, and you have to know exactly what they mean by it. So one of the other things that they got into trouble for was saying things like Mary was under the slavery of sin. Mary was an enemy of God. Mary was a daughter of wrath. Mary sinned. All of those in Adam. Okay, not in herself, but in Adam. And people were offended. They were offended that you would say Mary is a slave of sin in Adam. Now, in Adam as a qualifier is doing a lot of heavy lifting there.
Right.
Okay. So what they're saying is actually not theologically incorrect or heretical from their perspective, but within theology, besides things that are heretical or erroneous or proximate to heresy, we also have this category of theological censures or theological notes that are given to propositions that are sometimes called bad-sounding male sonans, or offensive to pious ears.
Right, and it goes back to what you were saying about how people are using different terminology, and it's very easy to equivocate or talk past each other or miscommunicate on these problems. And when you say things like, a child of sin in Adam, it can sound confusing.
Right, and they say, well, not in herself, but in Adam. Now, so that kind of alludes to what their position is, which I'll sort of outline here. So they argue very strongly against the idea of a debitum remotum. So they argue against remote debt, which is to say, they basically say, okay, Mary is being redeemed by Christ, and she's not being redeemed from the possibility of contracting original sin. She's being redeemed from contracting original sin. So she's being rescued not from being under Adam's headship. She's being rescued from contracting original sin, which means that for them, the debitum remotum is basically no debitum at all. That is, okay, you should have been under Adam's headship, but you were prevented from being under Adam's headship. They say that it doesn't work. It just dematerializes. It amounts to nothing other than saying Mary is just biologically descended from Adam, which is not the sufficient condition for the bestowal of original justice or for the non-bestowal of original justice, given the covenant. So let me just say a word about that. I may not have added that detail earlier, but the reason why the biological descent from Adam is a necessary but not a sufficient condition is precisely that the complex of gifts in original justice are supernatural or preternatural. So you should actually approach it from that perspective, that the condition for receiving these gifts is based on physical descent from Adam with the condition that he remain loyal and that promise itself. So if you take Mary out of that, then she's just in some entirely different providential order, they think. So they don't think there can be a real remote debt. So they argue for approximate debt. Now, they also have finer distinctions than that. So they talk about a debitum fundamentale and a debitum formale. So, okay, approximate debt. Well, you ask the question, well, what is that? In what sense should Mary have contracted original sin? Who is obliging her to contract original sin? And this is a very important question for those who deny that she had any debt of sin. Well, who places this obligation on her to begin with, or on anyone? Is this God? God is saying you all ought to contract original sin? And why would God say to Mary, you ought to contract original sin? Okay, as a whole other question. So there's a formal aspect and there's a foundational or there's a foundational aspect to the debitum proximum. That is, okay, first of all, what is it? And second of all, how does it serve as a basis, or what is the basis for it? So they think that Mary had a debitum formale / fundamentale, which is to say that she is descended from Adam, and so she should have contracted original sin by virtue of her descent from Adam, and by being under his headship. But there's more there's more distinctions from that. They spent a lot of time on this. They also distinguish, for example, debitum morale, debitum physicum. So you can talk about it as from a moral perspective or from a physical perspective. So that is to say, what is it in terms of of voluntary arrangements, and what is it in terms of like what is it in the nature of things?
Right.
Okay, so it's complicated. But in short, yeah, they were denounced. They were denounced to the Inquisition for saying some infelicitous things, and for some said implicitly denying the Immaculate Conception or being on the verge of it. Now, which could be a reason why, as they completed their course of theology, they went out of their way to almost overdo their emphasis on the Immaculate Conception. I think it was their just natural piety to begin with, but maybe they wanted to show that they weren't trying to do that. So right. I think they were misunderstood. I don't think that they actually said anything heretical.
Right.
And with the qualifications for what they understand, the things that they said within their system are correct and are not offensive to Mary, although you can certainly say, I wouldn't preach from the pulpit that Mary was a daughter of wrath and a slave to sin in Adam. I wouldn't be telling people that in the vestibule of the church. Now, within a systematic theology, with terms carefully defined, you can say that.
Sure. And if I may ask, was their position on the Debitum at all connected with their understanding of the primacy of Christ? Because I know that that's one of the motivations that a lot of the Scotists have for denying any Debitum, is that Mary is connected to Christ's predestination, and Christ is predestined prior to any consideration of sin. So too with Mary. And do they have any? Is there any connection there with the Salmanticenses?
This is a really interesting question to me. In my opinion, they actually have not worked that out to the extent which they should have or could have. I'll say that. I won't tell them what they should or should not have done. I mean, I didn't write a 20,000 page course of theology or whatever, right? So I mean, okay, if you plan it however you want to do it, if you're going to do it, right? Anyway, I won't tell them what they should or should not have done, but
right.
I think they could have worked that out. And actually, I think that if one were to deny any Debitum Peccati in Mary at all, probably, to my mind, one of the only ways, if not the only way, to make that count as redemption is, in fact, to take the position of the Salmanticenses, which is to say, okay, that Christ is decreed prior to taking the fact of sin into account, but the decree of Christ as Redeemer entails the permission of sin simultaneously. That is, there's a complex of causal perspectives that in an effective decree have to be dealt with together. So an effective decree is always going to be one that can be realized in the real world. And that means there have to be complementary causal perspectives taken into account. So to take a totally different example, if I want there to be a human soul, I'm creating a human soul, I imply the creation of the body by doing that, because the body is the material cause, the soul is the formal cause of the human being. So I can say, just by saying, I want to create a human soul, from that formal perspective, there is simultaneously implied that there will be a complementary material perspective. And then from that perspective, the body is actually the more primary element from its own perspective. So causes are causes of each other in different genera. Okay, so if Christ is decreed as Redeemer, and that's first in God's intention from the perspective of final cause, specifically from what they call the perspective of final cause cuius gratia, final cause for the sake of which that simultaneously implies other complementary causal perspectives, including material from the perspective of material cause, material concerning which sin, because Christ is being predestined or decreed effectively as Redeemer, and that implies the permission of sin. Okay, so if that's the way that the incarnation itself is decreed, then what I think you could say is that Mary is included in one and the same decree, because actually the decision-making process in God, even from a conceptual perspective, is very simple. All the circumstances are taken into account to begin with. God doesn't actually have to go through multiple conceptual stages to do that. He can do that all at once. So what you end up saying is, if you're going to say Mary had no Debitum Peccati, and you take the Salmanticenses position on the motive of the incarnation, you can say this. You can say Mary's entire existence is dependent on the sin of Adam, in the way that Christ's existence is dependent on the sin of Adam. That is, it's true that in the present providential order, if Adam had not sinned, Christ would not have come, which also makes it true that if Adam had not sinned, there would not be Mary, just as there would not be Christ. There would be no Mother of God, because there would be no incarnate Son of God. What that means is that Mary's entire existence is actually in the redemptive order. It's in the order that is established by God, because everything is for the sake of Christ the Redeemer. So you could say she has no proximate or remote debt of sin, because she's decreed independently of that, but she's not decreed independently of the fact of original sin. So the question I would then raise is, does that count as redemption? Does owing your entire existence to the redemptive order count as being redeemed? And that's an important question.
Sure.
And because I haven't defined the term or talked about it really with precision yet, I'll just say redemption is an aspect of salvation. So etymologically means buying back. So there's this sense of buying back or retrieving something that has been lost. So this is one reason why it was difficult to work out how the Immaculate Conception can be redemptive in the first place. It can certainly, and maybe more obviously, be salvific, which is to say, by not contracting original sin or personal sin, Mary is being saved from sin, but is she being redeemed from sin? And that was an important question. Now, sometimes, and in my view, this is a way I wish terminology had developed differently. Sometimes, and very frequently, theologians use redemption as a synonym for salvation.
Right.
I would rather that we actually didn't have that habit. And it's legitimate because it's synecdoche, it's part for the whole. So you can use the part to refer to the whole, that's fine. I would rather that we kind of were a little more careful with that sometimes, because redemption is an aspect of salvation, but it's not the only aspect of salvation. So Mary can be saved from original sin more obviously in the sense of being prevented from contracting it. The question is, does that count as redemption? Does that count as being rescued or bought back by the merits of Christ from original sin? And that question a fortiori applies to the no debitum position. That is, if you're under no obligation to contract original sin, there's no sense in which you should have contracted original sin. In what sense are you being effectively bought back or rescued from original sin?
Right. If I remember correctly, and I think I spoke with Gideon Lazar about this a while ago, that certain Franciscan theologians would sometimes distinguish between salvation and redemption, that they'd say that, okay, Mary was saved, but we don't need to claim that she was redeemed because she has no debt of sin in her, right?
Yeah, and that's a very logical position to hold when you take redemption in the strict theological sense, in the traditional sense. Now, the magisterium, in fact, has spoken of Mary as being redeemed, including the Second Vatican Council, so and other magisterial documents. So now the dogmatic definition of the Immaculate Conception, you could say, leaves it open a little bit, but other documents make clear that when Christ is spoken of as Savior, that includes the notion of Redeemer. So, for example, the Second Vatican Council, quoting earlier documents, says Mary was preserved in a more, or was redeemed in a more perfect way by preservation. So there has to be a true sense of redemption. Now, I'm perfectly fine with saying that it's an analogous sense. It's obviously not the same in every detail, that Mary is saved in a different way than we are, and therefore redeemed in a different way than we are. But there is a sense in which she's being redeemed, which, to my mind, implies there has to be some sense in which she ought to have contracted original sin, and that was prevented from happening, and that's a unique privilege. But yeah, the Debitum Peccati discussion is very complex. I almost wonder if it should have been framed in a different way, but it makes sense that it would arise in the way that it did and at the time that it did, because theologians wanting to hold the Immaculate Conception and wanting to hold that Mary was redeemed by Christ had to find a way in which she was being rescued from something that should have happened to her.
Right. Okay, circling back a little bit to the Salmanticenses again, if I can maybe ask like a closing question on their position, did they think that their view on the Debitum, did it at all diminish Mary's dignity or prestige in light of the Immaculate Conception? I mean, because if you make the case that Mary had a Debitum, it sounds not as great as if she had no Debitum at all, even if we're just talking about the would have, could have, and should have. I mean, what was their take on that?
Well, because they held it and because they had deep Marian piety, I don't think they thought it lessened Mary's dignity.
Sure.
I would suggest we need to frame the question of honor toward Mary and the dignity of Mary with reference to the honor owed to Christ and the dignity of Christ. And I think Mary herself would want us to do that. I don't think she would want us to focus on her as if she existed in isolation from her son. So the question is, Christ is Redeemer. And is Mary redeemed? And if she is, and she is, and she's the most perfectly redeemed, what does perfect redemption look like? So this is St. Thomas's principle. Essentially, it's actually a principle from from Aristotle's physics. It's a physical principle, but Aquinas applies it to the question of Mary's fullness of grace. That when you're closer to the source, you're closer to the principle, the effect is greater. The effect is more intense. So Mary is the most full of grace next to Christ because she's the closest to Christ. That's what Aquinas says about Mary's fullness of grace. So Mary's closest to the Redeemer, so she's the most redeemed. She enjoys the effect the most. So I don't think it lessens Mary's dignity to talk about the greatness of the effect.
Sure.
So what that means is that I would say emphasizing just how much Mary has been saved by Christ doesn't lessen her dignity at all. It actually enhances it because it implies and means that she's closer to him. Because he, in fact, is the source of all grace that is given to the human race, at least since the fall. All of it comes through Christ in some way and through some kind of connection with him. So I don't think Mary would want us to focus on her apart from Christ in some way. Now, I'm not suggesting that those who deny the Debitum Peccati are doing that, because what they actually want to do is to include Mary with Christ in a decree that is even more primary and even greater than the permission of sin itself, and to say Mary was only ever always under Christ's headship and only ever meant to be under Christ's headship, and therefore is preserved from sin in this much even greater way. So people, I think everyone's trying to say the best about Mary that can be said, because they're trying to say the best about Christ that can be said. And these are different ways of trying to work out, how does the effect of grace come to Mary from Christ, and how does that relate to the question of original sin? Again, the dogma of the Immaculate Conception is framed in relation to original sin. It's framed in a negative way, really. Mary has not contracted the stain of original sin. So it could have been expressed in terms of the fullness of grace. Mary is as full of grace as any human person can be, or something like that. However, I do think the negative framing is helpful because we tend to understand the greatness of the gift in relation to conceiving of its absence. So this happens all the time in just normal life. When we lose something, we realize how important it was to us. For example, so when we think about the fullness of grace by itself, that it doesn't tell us that much. When we think about the lack of grace that we all experience at our own conception and birth, and to say, wow, Mary's fullness of grace is actually so great that it penetrates all the way back to her conception and that she was never without it, that tells us something more. But
right.
Of course, then you have to account for the way in which you're being saved from something that should have happened.
Right. It almost seems like there's drawbacks and then there's advantages of how you express it either in a positive way or in a negative way, and how there are a lot of advantages if we were to simply express it more so in relation to Christ in a more positive manner, right?
I think so. So this is an area that I hope theology takes up again and maybe works out a better way of talking about it. The terminology has got to be clarified. Eventually, the magisterium could potentially intervene and give us some more precise parameters or guidelines.
Right.
There are little allusions here and there, and some people will claim that Ineffabilis Deus, for example, Pius IX, rules out the Debitum Peccati and Mary. I don't think it does, but some people would say that, and so forth. So it's an area that could be rediscovered and kind of reinvigorated, and maybe as interest in predestination, providence, the motive of the incarnation, and things like that, maybe as those grow, we'll also rediscover this discussion and maybe find a better or clearer way of talking about it together.
Right. All right. Well, I figured we've discussed everything I've wanted to discuss in this episode. Thank you so much for coming on. Do you have any book recommendations on maybe this question, or maybe Mariology in general? What could you recommend?
Oh goodness. Well, there are tons of good books on Mariology. Really lots of good stuff coming out, and stuff that has come out historically. On the Debitum Peccati, there's that book chapter in the Oxford Handbook of Early Modern Theology by Trent Pomplin, the Baroque Catholic theologies of Christ and Mary. That's a very helpful overview of the relationship of some of these things. There is an entire book on the Salmanticenses in relation to the question of the Immaculate Conception, which also touches on this, by Enrique del Sagrado Corazon. Wrote a book entirely on the Salmanticenses and their relationship to the Immaculate Conception, which also touches on the Debitum Peccati. And it's an older book, but it's entirely on this subject, on their Mariology, and specifically the Immaculate Conception. So that's worth reading. There's also a book by Juniper Carroll entirely on the Debitum Peccati, in which he gives a history of the controversy over it. So he just summarizes very, very briefly the position of many different theologians. And it's helpful. It gives you a lot of citations. So you always want to go and read the primary source, though. You never want to rely merely on a couple paragraph summary of someone's position. But Juniper Carroll is a Franciscan, very involved in Mariology and the primacy of Christ and things like that, and wrote some very helpful books on these subjects. So he has a book entirely on the Debitum Peccati.
Right. All right. Well, Father Schrader, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks a lot. Very glad to be with you.